Ma'am, this lane is for priority passengers, the gate agent said, her voice carrying just enough volume to make the people behind Naomi Carter look up from their phones. Naomi didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been standing for the past 3 minutes, carry-on bag over one shoulder, encrypted tablet case under her arm, boarding pass extended in her right hand, with the patience of someone who had done this particular calculation 1,000 times and knew exactly what it cost and exactly what it was worth. She looked at the agent, a young woman with a neat blonde bun and a smile she had clearly not been using for the past 30 seconds, and she said, calmly and without inflection, "My name is Dr. Carter. I'm in seat 2B. This is my boarding pass." The agent took it, held it, looked at it with the kind of focused attention she had not applied to the last 4 passengers, all of whom had been waved through with nothing more than a glance and a nod. Then she looked up, looked at Naomi, looked back down at the pass, and said, "I'll need to verify this." "Of course," Naomi said. Behind her, the man in the charcoal suit she had watched him arrive 4 minutes after her was already through the gate. It was 6:42 in the evening at Dulles International Airport, and the light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows was doing the thing it sometimes did in late autumn, that particular trick of turning the whole terminal gold for exactly 11 minutes before surrendering to dark. The planes lined up on the tarmac looked enormous and still in that light, like animals resting before a long migration. Gate B-17 smelled of recycled air and overpriced coffee, and the faint electrical hum of a building that never fully sleeps. Naomi had stood in this exact spot, or a version of it, in airports across 11 time zones in the past 3 months. She knew the smell. She knew the weight of it. She knew, without having to think about it, that the agent had just decided something about her before she ever opened her mouth, and that nothing Naomi said or showed would fully undo that decision. It would only redirect it. The agent returned the boarding pass without apology. "Enjoy your flight," she said. The warmth switched back on, a little too bright, the way a lamp flickers before it settles. Naomi said, "Thank you," and meant nothing by it either way. She had closed a 9-month operation 16 hours ago. Not closed in the sense of a press conference or a ceremony. There would be none of that. There never was. But closed in the sense that a web of domestic financing tied to a cyber-terrorism network spanning 3 continents had been dismantled so completely that the people responsible for it would spend the next several years trying to understand how it happened. The press would never hear about it. The faces on the monitors in the Situation Room would simply vanish. But in a back office at the Department of Homeland Security, people who had not slept properly in 9 months would sleep tonight. And that was the job. And the job was enough. Now she was on her way to London to brief their British intelligence counterparts on what came next. Her go-bag was always packed. She had learned that in her first year when a 3-day operation stretched to 3 weeks, and she had to buy socks from a hotel gift shop in Phoenix. That was 12 years ago. She didn't buy hotel socks anymore. She carried Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in the front pocket of her carry-on on every single flight, not as an affectation, not as something to be seen carrying, but because the man wrote about power and restraint and the interior life of someone who had to hold a great deal very quietly, and she found that useful. She had found it useful this morning, in fact, when her mother called from Baltimore at 5 a.m. and said, "You sound tired, baby," and Naomi had said, "I'm fine." Ma and her mother had said in the way only mothers can. That's what you always say. Her mother's name was Gloria, and she was 63 years old, and she had once been turned away from a maternity ward in Baltimore, turned away at the desk by a receptionist who looked at her insurance card and decided without checking the system, without making a single phone call, that it couldn't be right. This was in 1986. Gloria Carter had her baby in a hallway 20 minutes later on a gurney that a passing orderly had the sense to wheel out from a supply room. Naomi had heard this story so many times that it had become less a story and more a geological fact, something that had shaped the landscape of her life the way tectonic pressure shapes mountains, slowly, invisibly, and permanently. That kind of memory doesn't stay in the past. It travels in the body. She settled into seat 2, B window seat, Italian leather, the particular quiet of first class, before the cabin fills, and arranged her things with the precision of someone trained to know where everything is without looking. Encrypted tablet on top, meditations tucked in the front pocket, and beneath both of them, fitted into the interior slot of her structured handbag, the small black leather case that went everywhere she went. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She simply knew it was there, the way you know where your heartbeat is without pressing your fingers to your wrist. The cabin was filling in around her. A woman with pearl earrings and a silk scarf settled into one. Adjusting the seat with the ease of someone who had done it many times. An older man in a navy suit was already established in 3B. A glass of bourbon resting on his tray table, his laptop glowing with spreadsheets that had the particular density of someone in finance. Across the aisle, a teenager dropped into 4A with the practiced sprawl of youth earbuds and phone out, fully committed to existing in his own atmosphere. Then the sound of boots on carpet, purposeful, measured each step landing with the quiet authority of a man who knew the geometry of the room, and Naomi looked up just slightly, just enough. Captain Derek Hollis was doing his pre-boarding cabin walk, the kind that senior pilots do when they want the first-class passengers to feel personally attended to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with thick blonde hair going silver-gray at the roots, in a way that had clearly been considered and found distinguished. His silver wings caught the cabin light. He moved through the forward section like a man in a room that had been built for him, which in many ways it had. He shook hands with the man in 3B called him by a name that sounded like a title, laughed with him about something brief and exclusive, moved to 1. Greeted the pearl earring woman with the kind of warmth that said they had spoken before. Then he reached Naomi's row and paused. Not long, half a second, maybe less, but it was the kind of pause that has nothing to do with time and everything to do with intention. His eyes moved from her face to her bag, to the seat number on the overhead panel, and something moved behind them that was not curiosity and was not concern. It was the quiet beginning of a calculation. He moved on without speaking. She did not look up from her book until she heard the next row. She had seen that pause before, in marble-floored lobbies and polished boardrooms and airport gates and every other space in her life that had been designed in ways both spoken and unspoken for someone other than her. A place where certain passengers never had to show their boarding pass twice. A place where the type of champagne you declined said more about you than the one you accepted. She was well acquainted with that pause. She knew what it meant, and she knew what it could cost, and she knew with 12 years of training and instinct behind her how to hold it in the palm of her hand and wait. The cabin door sealed shut with a pressurized hiss. Outside, the baggage carts trundled past in the fading gold light. The last of evening reflected off the fuselage in long, flat ribbons. Naomi opened Meditations to a marked page and found the line she had underlined months ago in a hotel in Albuquerque at 3 a.m. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. She did not know yet how necessary that line was about to become. The plane began to move. 35 minutes into the flight, Liberty Atlantic 227 had settled into its cruising altitude, and the first-class cabin had found its rhythm. The soft percussion of a long transatlantic crossing, laptops, opening blankets being arranged, the particular kind of quiet that descends on a plane when people make peace with the hours ahead of them. The lights had softened slightly. Outside the windows, the last of America's coastline had disappeared beneath a low shelf of clouds, and now there was only dark water and a sky beginning to fill with stars. Priya Nair moved through the cabin with the focused efficiency of someone in only her second year on transatlantic routes, which meant she was still learning the difference between performing a service and actually providing one. She was 26 with dark hair pulled back cleanly and an expression that cycled between professional warmth and the kind of barely contained alertness that comes from trying very hard to get everything right. She had read the first-class manifest before boarding, as she always did, because she believed that knowing people's names before they had to tell you was the most basic possible form of respect. She reached seat 2B. "Dr. Carter," she said, "may I offer you something before we reach cruising altitude? We have champagne bourbon, still water with lime." Naomi looked up from her book. "Sparkling water with lime, please," she said. And then, "Thank you, Priya." Something shifted in Priya's face, not dramatic, just a small recalibration, the look of someone who had just been seen more precisely than expected. She was used to being addressed as Miss or Hey, or not at all. She said, "Of course I'll be right back," and her voice had dropped half a register, some small formality dissolving. Naomi watched her go and then returned to her book. She had grown up in Southeast Washington in a row house with her parents and 3 sisters. The second daughter of a postal worker named Edward Carter, who read history books on his lunch breaks and had strong opinions about Frederick Douglass and weak opinions about professional basketball, and who had driven her to Howard University on a Tuesday morning in late August, helped carry her bags to the 3rd floor of the dormitory, and then stood in the parking lot afterward and cried quietly the way men of his generation cried, with their backs to the nearest observer, and told her not to tell anyone. She had not told anyone. She had simply carried it. She graduated Howard with honors in political science and went immediately into federal service because she had known since she was 19 years old, sitting in a constitutional law seminar, that the intersection of law and power and justice was where she was meant to spend her working life. She joined the FBI at 26, transferred to the Department of Homeland Security at 31. She was 38 now and 12 years into a career that most people didn't know existed, doing work that would never be publicly attributed to her solving problems that the public would never know had existed. She had been the only black woman in the room so many times that she had stopped keeping count somewhere around year 4. Not because it stopped mattering, but because tracking it was a tax on her attention that she couldn't afford to keep paying. Her mentor, retired Deputy Director Adeyeze Nwosu, had told her on her first day at DHS, standing in the hallway outside the operations floor, "You will be watched more closely than anyone else in this building. By everyone. For different reasons. Use it." Naomi had written that down in a notebook she still kept in a drawer at home in Alexandria. She had used it. She was using it right now. The encrypted tablet in her bag contained briefing documents for the London meeting, not the kind of meeting that gets a calendar entry with a descriptive title, but the kind that gets a code name and a room with no windows and a guest list of 8. The intelligence she was carrying in her head and in carefully encrypted files involved a financial network with connections across 3 continents that had been funding operations her agency had been tracking for the better part of 2 years. The London briefing was the next phase. The stakes were not abstract. She needed to arrive. She needed to be present. And she needed this flight to be exactly what it appeared to be, unremarkable. Priya returned with the sparkling water lime wedge on the rim and set it on the tray table with a small, careful exactness. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, and this time there was something genuine underneath the professional courtesy, something that had not been there 60 seconds ago. Naomi thanked her and meant it, and Priya moved on. The man in 3B had set aside his laptop. He was in his mid-60s, Naomi estimated, with a silver beard trimmed close, and the bearing of someone who had long ago stopped needing to announce himself in rooms, because rooms had learned to notice him without prompting. He was reading the Financial Times with the unhurried attention of someone who was not checking the markets for anxiety but for information. He had not looked at her directly since boarding, which she had noted and found in an odd way restful. He existed in her peripheral awareness like a fixed-point, stable, quiet present. His name, she would not learn until much later, was Walter Osei, and he had been a senior partner at an international trade advisory firm for 22 years, and before that a diplomat, and before that a graduate student at Oxford who had grown up in Accra and learned very young that the world had specific ideas about where men who looked like him belonged, and that the most powerful thing he could do about those ideas was to outlast them with such complete composed excellence that the ideas eventually looked exhausted by comparison. He had not spoken to anyone since boarding, but when Priya had brought him his water earlier and then been distracted before she could return to Naomi's row, he had quietly flagged her back and said in a voice low enough to carry only as far as intended, "I believe 2B is still waiting." No drama, no accusation, just the steady application of attention. Naomi had noticed. She had not acknowledged it visibly. Then the sound of the cockpit door opening and Captain Derek Hollis moved back through the cabin a second time. He was not doing passenger greetings now. He moved with his hands slightly loose at his sides and his eyes moving across the rows with the particular quality of attention that was not really attention at all, but something that used attention as a disguise. He paused at Priya's station near the forward galley and said something in a voice too low for the cabin to hear. Priya's expression shifted a fraction. Nothing more, and then he moved on. Naomi turned a page. Her hand rested flat on the open book. She was not reading. The water glass sat untouched on the tray table, condensation beginning to form on the outside. The stars outside the window were very clear at this altitude, the kind of clarity that doesn't exist at ground level, all that atmosphere pressing down and blurring everything. Up here things were sharper. Edges held their shape. You could see what was coming from a long way off if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. 55 minutes into the flight, Captain Derek Hollis walked back into the first-class cabin with the look of a man who had decided something. It wasn't the walk of the pre-boarding charm offensive. That walk had been loose, deliberate, the performance of someone who knows they are being watched and enjoys it. This walk was tighter, the arms held slightly closer to the body, the jaw set with a kind of purpose that had dressed itself up as professionalism and was not quite succeeding. He stopped at row 2. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried a particular weight, not the weight of courtesy, but the weight of something that had decided to use courtesy as a container. "I just need to verify a few things before we get too far into the crossing. Would you mind showing me your boarding pass again?" Naomi marked her page. She set the book, spine down, on her lap with care. She did not rush and she did not hesitate. She moved with the particular calibration of someone who has learned that the speed at which you comply with an unjust request communicates more than the compliance itself. She reached into her bag, retrieved the boarding pass, and extended it toward him without a word. He took it. He looked at it with the focused, squinting attention of a man examining fine print, which was interesting because the print on a boarding pass is not particularly fine, and there was nothing on hers that differed from the boarding passes of the 11 other first-class passengers whose passes he had not requested. Dr. Naomi Carter. He read aloud, his voice rising slightly on the title, lending it a quality that sat somewhere between inquiry and skepticism, as if the word doctor were a claim being made rather than a fact being stated. "That's correct," she said. "What kind of doctor are you, if you don't mind my asking?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind who values her privacy," she said, not unkindly, but with a precision in each syllable that left exactly no room for a follow-up. He did not give her back the boarding pass. He held it between two fingers and set his voice dropping into a lower register that was clearly designed to suggest confidentiality. "We've had issues lately, and I don't say this lightly, with individuals accessing first class using reward points accumulated under someone else's credentials. It's become a real concern for the airline. For security reasons, I'll need to see a government-issued identification to match this ticket." The cabin around them had gone a degree quieter. Not dramatically, no one turned their head, but the specific quality of the ambient noise had changed in the way that happens when people stop performing inattentiveness and start practicing it in earnest. Naomi looked at him. She understood with complete clarity what was happening. She also understood the calculus she could end this in 4 seconds by producing one document and ending it quickly was tactically smarter than allowing it to breathe and grow. Escalation was visible. Visibility on a mission was a liability. She was carrying intelligence in her head that mattered more than her dignity in this aisle, and she knew that, and knowing it was not defeat, it was strategy. She reached into her bag. Past the holster, the weight of it familiar as her own pulse. Past the small black leather credential case tucked between her lip balm and a travel-sized ibuprofen. Her fingers found her wallet. She drew out her New York State driver's license and held it out to him. This, she thought, will end it. He took the license. And this was the moment when something changed in the air of the cabin in a way that couldn't be walked back. He did not simply look at it and return it. He held it up to the overhead light. He turned it over. He squinted at it with an expression of theatrical scrutiny, as if the lamination of a state-issued ID were a thing that required extended forensic examination. He said, turning it over again. He made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. "It's a good photo," he said finally. "Very professional." Naomi said nothing. She let the silence do the work. "The thing is," he said, his voice dropping further now, closer, confidential in the way that things are confidential when they are meant to carry. "This can be faked. These days you'd be surprised it's not actually that hard." He paused, and then leaning slightly forward. "Pretty girl like you, you'd be amazed what some people will do for a taste of comfort they haven't earned." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. He had not shouted them. He had not performed them. He had said them in the voice of a man sharing a quiet observation, which was worse because it meant he believed he was in a room where this was the kind of thing that could be said. In the galley forward, Priya Nair had gone completely still, a tray of drinks balanced in both hands staring at a fixed point on the wall. In 3B, Walter Ose did not move at all, but the page of his newspaper stopped turning. The pearl-earring woman in 1A had gone very quiet in a way that suggested she had heard and was deciding in real time what hearing it meant for her. Naomi drew a breath, steady, measured the breath of someone who has been trained to operate under conditions that most people never encounter, and who has learned that the body is the first thing you must manage before you can manage anything else. "Captain Hollis," she said, her voice level and clear. "Please return my identification to me." It was not a request. The grammar was a request, but nothing else about it was. He looked at her, and for just a second, 1 second, something moved behind his eyes that might have been hesitation. But then his pride, which was the kind of pride that has been building on a foundation of unchallenged authority for many years and does not know how to absorb a direct sentence from someone it has already decided to dismiss, surged back like a wave that had momentarily pulled back from the shore. "I don't think so," he said. And he bent the license just slightly, just enough, between his thumb and forefinger, testing it as if he were assessing the flexibility of the plastic. "This feels flimsy," he said. Laminations peeling at the corner. She saw it coming before it happened. She knew with the particular foreknowledge of someone who has been in rooms where things became irreversible that the next second was going to change the character of everything that followed it. She could not stop it. She could only witness it with absolute clarity so that every detail would be available to her later. The plastic gave with a sound that was startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. A clean, deliberate crack, the sound of something being broken on purpose, rather than by accident, which is a different sound entirely, and everyone in earshot knew the difference. He held the two halves for 1 moment, looked at them, and then dropped them onto Naomi's tray table with a small, conclusive movement, the way you might put down a pen after signing a document. "Problem solved," he said. His voice had recovered something, a smoothness, a self-satisfaction that had found its footing again after the brief wobble. "We'll have airport security get everything sorted properly when we land in London. In the meantime, enjoy your flight." He turned. He walked back toward the cockpit with the stride of a man who believed he had just resolved something, the step of a man who had never in his professional life been made to account for what he did in the aisles of his aircraft. The cockpit door opened and closed, and the sound of it was the sound of someone exiting a room they expected to return to on their own terms. The cabin was very still. Naomi sat without moving and looked at the 2 pieces of her driver's license on the tray table in front of her. The photo was visible on the larger piece her face composed, looking straight ahead, taken 3 years ago in a DMV office in Manhattan on a Tuesday morning. The lamination was not peeling. It had never been peeling. That part had been a lie so transparent it hadn't even been trying very hard. She placed her right hand flat on the tray table very close to the broken pieces, but not touching them. Her fingers did not tremble. But something behind her eyes had shifted quietly, decisively, the way a door moves when it has been locked from the inside. 10 seconds passed. Naomi counted them without meaning to, the way you count your own heartbeat when the room has gone quiet enough to hear it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved with any purpose. The cabin had the particular quality of stillness that happens when a group of people has collectively witnessed something they are each privately deciding whether to acknowledge, and the deciding is taking longer than it should, and everyone knows it is taking longer than it should, and that knowledge is its own kind of weight. The pearl earring woman in 1A was looking at her tray table with the focused attention of someone studying it for the first time. The bourbon man in 3B had set his glass down with care, the way you set something down when you want your hands free but you don't yet know for what. The teenager in 4A, who had pulled out one earbud at some point during the confrontation and had not put it back, was staring at the headrest in front of him with the expression of someone who has just understood something about the world that they would have preferred to learn differently. Walter Osei had folded his newspaper and placed it in the seat pocket in front of him, which was in the context of everything else happening in this cabin, a gesture of complete and deliberate attention. He sat with his hands resting on the armrests and did not look at Naomi and did not look away from the direction of the cockpit door, and there was something in his stillness that was not passivity, but rather the stillness of a person who has arrived at a decision and is waiting for the right moment to implement it. Then, Priya Nair appeared from the forward galley. She was moving carefully, not slowly, but carefully in the way of someone who is acutely aware of every eye in the room and is trying to navigate the difference between her job, which had clear parameters, and her conscience, which currently had none. She had a white cloth napkin in one hand, folded into a small rectangle, and she carried it with both hands, as though it were something more than it was, as though the gesture of bringing it to Naomi's row were the only ceremony available to her in this moment. She crouched slightly beside seat 2B. Her voice was very quiet, not whispering exactly, but low enough to suggest that she was making a choice about what the rest of the cabin could hear. "I'm so sorry," she said, and her voice had an unsteady quality that she was visibly trying to control. He's not usually like this." Naomi looked at her steadily for a moment. Something in Priya's face was earnest and young and caught between the loyalty of 6 months under Hollis's command and the simple undeniability of what she had just watched happen. Naomi did not want to punish her for being in that position, but she was not going to let the sentence pass without naming it. "Not usually like this," she said quietly. "That is the most common defense offered for men like him, and it is never as reassuring as the person saying it hopes it will be." She paused just briefly. "But you didn't tear the ID. I know that." Priya flinched a small involuntary contraction of the shoulders, as if the gentleness of the statement had been harder to receive than anger would have been. Her mouth opened and then closed. She looked down at the 2 pieces of laminated plastic on the tray table and said very softly, "May I take those?" Naomi nodded. Priya picked up the pieces with the care of someone handling something that mattered not, carelessly, not with the briskness of routine, but with a deliberateness that said she understood what she was holding. She found a small, sealable bag from her apron pocket, the kind used for passenger medications. Nothing special, and she placed the pieces inside it and pressed the seal closed with slow, precise fingers, the way you close something you intend to remember closing. She held it out to Naomi, and Naomi took it, and she placed it into her handbag with the same deliberateness with which Priya had sealed it. "Thank you," Naomi said. Priya nodded just once and stood and walked back toward the galley, and as she went, she paused at the partition and looked back once, and then she was gone. Through the slightly ajar cockpit door, Naomi could hear the faint sound of Hollis's voice relaxed, carrying the particular cadence of a man talking easily over a radio frequency. No strain in it at all. Nothing that suggested the preceding minutes had registered as anything requiring reflection. The sound of it moved through her like a cold current. Not because it surprised her, she knew exactly what that absence of consequence sounded like. She had been hearing it in one form or another for her entire adult life, but because it clarified something. It moved the internal dial from restraint to readiness with the quiet inevitability of a compass needle finding north. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her own interior, to feel it fully. Not to perform feeling it. She was alone in that space. There was no audience, but to actually feel the specific weight of being publicly humiliated by a man who hadn't even bothered to conceal his motivation. The cold of it. The particular exhaustion of having to be impeccable in the face of someone who felt no obligation to be anything at all. She had been trained for volatile environments, for rooms with armed people in them, for operations that involved real danger and real stakes, and she knew how to hold herself together under conditions that would unravel most people. But this kind of battlefield was different. The weapons here were quiet. The damage was designed to be unverifiable. The uniform on the other side was the same uniform that was supposed to mean safety. Her mentor's voice came back to her Adaeze Nwosu, who had retired 3 years ago to a house in Maryland with a garden she was finally learning to maintain, who had spent 30 years doing exactly this work, and had given Naomi the most useful single sentence anyone had ever offered her in 12 years of federal service. Real power never needs to announce itself. But it knows when to stand up. She knew. The hour was not here yet, but it was coming, and she could feel it approaching the way you feel weather changing before it arrives, a shift in pressure, a particular quality in the air. Walter Osei moved then, and the movement was so quiet and so unhurried that it almost escaped notice. He reached into the seat pocket in front of him and retrieved his folded newspaper, and he opened it again. But he turned it slightly, just slightly, so that the front page with its headline about a trade agreement she recognized from her briefing files was angled toward her at the periphery of her vision. It was not an offer of reading material. It was the gesture of a person saying in a language that required no translation, "I see you. I am here. I am not going anywhere." He did not look at her when he did it. She did not acknowledge it visibly. But something in her steadied a small but real steadying, the kind that comes not from reassurance, but from the simple knowledge that you are not invisible, that at least one person in the room is present with their eyes open. She reached into her bag and withdrew Meditations, and opened it to the underlined passage. The words were there as they always were. You have power over your mind, not outside events. She read them once. Then she read them again, and then she sat with her hand flat on the open page and looked out the window at the absolutely dark Atlantic, where there was nothing to see but the reflection of the cabin lights against the glass, and somewhere far below invisible water, and somewhere far above stars that had not changed their position for human trouble in several billion years. She was not reading anymore. She was deciding. An hour and a half into the flight, the cockpit door opened, and no one in first class had been expecting that. The rhythm of the cabin had settled into its uneasy truce. Passengers dozing or pretending to the overhead lights dimmed to the amber of a long-haul crossing. The quiet punctuated only by Priya's soft footsteps as she made rounds and the occasional clink of a glass being set down. The confrontation with Hollis had not been spoken about. People had returned to their phones and their books and their blankets with the determined focus of individuals who have decided to treat something they witnessed as something that did not happen to them, and who are discovering that this is harder than it sounds. Then his boots on the carpet again. That sound. The particular cadence of it. Hollis moved back into the first-class cabin with his spine straight and his hands loose at his sides, and the difference between this entrance and the last one was that this time the professional polish was showing its seams. He had clearly spent the intervening 90 minutes in the cockpit constructing a narrative, building it carefully, the way you build something when you know it has to hold weight, and now he had come back to finish what the narrative required him to finish. He stopped at row 2 again. Of course he did. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice carrying the smoothness of someone who has rehearsed his opening. "But your name has come up on our internal manifest in connection with something I need to clarify. We've had ongoing issues with reward point transfers, people accumulating points under one name and booking under another. And your itinerary has some flags that standard security protocol requires me to address." He delivered it well. It was almost convincing, the language of procedure, the cadence of routine. But the thing about a story constructed to replace another story is that the construction is always slightly visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention, and Naomi was paying exactly that kind of attention. "I see," she said in a voice that communicated nothing beyond the 2 words. "If you could just tell me a little more about what you do," he continued, the reasonable tone holding, "we could clear this up quickly. Just for the record, I file reports," she said. "Long ones, bureaucratic in nature. You wouldn't find them very interesting." He didn't like that. The reasonable tone cracked at the edges, barely just enough to see through. His hand moved to the headrest of the seat across the aisle, gripping it with a casual pressure that was not casual, and he said with a smile that had stopped reaching his eyes somewhere in the last 30 seconds, "I'm sure a woman in your position understands the importance of cooperation with security personnel." "A woman in my position," she repeated, and let the phrase sit in the air of the cabin where everyone could see it. His jaw tightened. He leaned slightly forward, not dramatically, but enough that Priya, watching from the galley doorway, took one involuntary step back. His voice dropped to the register he had used before the register, that pretended to be private, while being anything but. "Look a pretty face and a confident manner, those things can only carry you so far. At 30,000 feet, there's no hiding who you really are and where you really come from." The cabin went absolutely still. Not the polite, maintained stillness of people pretending not to listen. This was the stillness of people who had stopped pretending entirely, who were listening with their whole bodies, who were realizing in real time that the thing they had been half hoping was over had not been over at all, and had now escalated past any point where they could comfortably remain uninvested. Priya's hand was braced against the galley partition. The teenage boy had his phone flat on the tray in front of him, the screen dark, but his hand was resting beside it. The pearl earring woman had turned not fully, but enough her head tilted slightly toward the aisle. The bourbon man, who had not looked at Naomi or at Hollis or at anything except his laptop since the first confrontation, had closed the laptop. And Walter Osei, in 3A, set down his newspaper. He set it down the way you set down something that you are finished with, and he looked at Hollis with the unhurried, settled attention of a man who has made a decision in his own time and does not require permission to implement it. "Captain," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, with the particular precision of a man whose voice had spent decades carrying in rooms where the temperature was not always friendly. Hollis turned his head. He had not expected the interruption, and the surprise of it moved briefly across his face before the professional composure tried to cover it. Walter Osei looked at him without hostility and without performance. "You should return to the cockpit," he said. "You've made your point. Now you should go." "This is a security matter," Hollis said, his voice recovering its authority. "I'd ask you not to interfere." "I'm not interfering," Walter said calmly. "I'm observing. There's a difference. And what I'm observing is a captain spending the better part of 2 hours harassing a passenger who has done nothing to warrant it in front of a full cabin of witnesses, which is the kind of thing that has consequences." He paused just briefly. "Go back to the cockpit." Hollis opened his mouth. He looked at Osei. He looked at Priya, who had straightened in the doorway and was not stepping back anymore. He looked at the teenager who had picked up his phone. He looked at the pearl earring woman who was now facing him directly, and at the bourbon man who was watching with his hands flat on the table. He looked at the cabin, the place where for 23 years his word had been the final word, where his uniform had been the final argument, and he saw that it had shifted. It had shifted in the small, irreversible way that things shift when enough people in a room stop performing unawareness at the same moment and start being simply plainly present, and the combined weight of their presence has changed the atmosphere so completely that the old rules no longer quite apply. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit. His stride had changed. It was almost imperceptible, the difference between a man choosing to leave and a man retreating, but it was there. The door closed behind him, and this time the sound of it was different too. Not a sound of completion, a sound of something avoiding an accounting it could already feel coming. Naomi let her breath go slowly. She did not look at Walter Osei. He had already returned to his newspaper, or appeared to his eyes were on the page, but the page was the same page it had been on before. In a few seconds he turned it. That was the whole interaction. It had cost him something, and he had spent it without announcing that he was spending it, which was the most dignified kind of generosity. Priya retreated to the galley, and Naomi could hear beneath the ambient sounds of the flight the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. She picked up her book. She turned to the marked passage. She read it. James Reeve had been flying transatlantic routes for 8 years, the last 6 of them as first officer on this specific cabin class, with Derek Hollis as his captain. And in 6 years he had learned to read the man the way you learn to read weather, not from what it said, but from the particular way it moved. He knew when Hollis was tired and managing it through bravado. He knew when he'd had a difficult call with airline management and was nursing a grievance. He knew the walk of a man who had just done something in the cabin he was constructing a story to justify. Hollis came through the cockpit door, and the story was already running. "Passenger in 2B, he said, dropping into the captain's chair and adjusting the headset with more force than necessary. "Traveling on a potentially fraudulent booking. Uncooperative with standard verification procedures. I've documented it." Reeve said nothing. His hands were on the yoke, his eyes on the instruments, the practiced calm of a man doing his job with full attention. He had heard everything through the cockpit's communication system, not by trying, simply by virtue of proximity, and he had heard the first confrontation and the second, and the sound of something cracking and the particular quality of the silence that had followed. James Hollis said with the edge of a man seeking confirmation and not receiving it. "Passenger in 2B. Suspicious activity," I heard Reeve said. A pause. "Then you understand why the intervention was necessary." Reeve was quiet for long enough that Hollis understood the silence was not thoughtfulness, but something else. Then Reeve turned his head not fully just enough to address him sideways the way you address someone when you want them to know you are choosing your words, and said, "I heard all of it, Travis." Something in Hollis's posture changed. Not collapse, not yet, but a small compression, as if he had pulled his edges slightly inward. "You think this is about race?" he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an admission. It was the preemptive framing of a man who knew where the conversation was heading and wanted to arrive there first and reposition the furniture before anyone else came in. I think Reeves said carefully that what I saw was a captain leaving the cockpit twice during a transatlantic crossing to personally challenge a first-class passenger who had done nothing irregular, and then I heard something break. He paused. I think I need to know whether that was what it sounded like. Hollis said nothing. Reeve waited. The instruments hummed. 37,000 feet below them, the Atlantic was doing what it always did, which was nothing, which was everything, which was simply being there and being indifferent. It was her, I.D. Hollis said finally, and his voice had shifted into something that was trying to sound reasonable and was beginning to strain under the effort. It was flimsy. I was checking authenticity. "You broke it," Reeves said. "I examined it. You broke a Federal." Reeves stopped himself. He took a breath. He said very quietly, "You broke her identification. Travis. In front of 12 passengers and 1 crew member after spending 90 minutes creating reasons to challenge her in public after saying things that I heard and that every person within 4 rows heard." He turned fully toward Hollis now. "I have been flying with you for 6 years. I know how good you are at this job. And I know that what just happened in that cabin has nothing to do with this job." Hollis sat with his jaw set and his eyes forward and the particular rigidity of a man who is waiting for the person speaking to finish so he can begin explaining why everything they said is wrong. "I've been a captain for 23 years, he said. "I have 300,000 hours of flight time and a record without a single safety incident." A complaint from 1 passenger. "She's not just a passenger," Reeves said. The words fell in a way that made the cockpit feel smaller. Hollis blinked. "What does that mean?" Reeve did not answer. He opened a channel to London Center instead. The routine position report that the crossing required nothing extraordinary in the request itself, and then, at the end of the standard exchange, added 4 words that were not routine, requesting isolated hard stand upon arrival. London Center's response was immediate and professional. "Copy that, 227. Confirm law enforcement presence required at gate." "Confirm," Reeves said. "Internal protocol incident, standard procedure." The channel closed. The cockpit was quiet again, just the engines and the instruments and the particular sound of 2 men in proximity who are no longer navigating in the same direction. Hollis had heard the exchange. His face had changed, not dramatically the way a face changes in films with widening eyes and a sharp intake of breath, but in the quiet way of a man who has just felt the size of the room he is in. His hands came to rest on his thighs with a flatness that suggested they had stopped trusting themselves to do anything useful. "Don't let them take my license," he said, and his voice had lost its bearing for the first time since the flight began. It was the voice of a man who had been standing on something that had just shifted beneath his feet, looking for something to hold on to and finding nothing available. "James, 8 years. You know what this career means to me. Don't let them." Reeve turned to the windscreen. He checked an instrument. He adjusted a setting that did not need adjusting. He did these things with the focused deliberateness of a man choosing to locate himself in the concrete and the procedural, because the alternative was to sit in the middle of something he could not fix. He did not answer. In the jump seat behind the command chair, Hollis sat with his thick blonde hair slightly disheveled where his hand had moved through it twice, a gesture he probably didn't know he was making, and stared at the control panel that had been the landscape of his professional identity for more than 2 decades, and found that it was offering him nothing useful in return. Ahead of them, through the windscreen, the horizon was beginning to show its first gray intimation of London, a faint smudge where the darkness was starting to relent, where light was gathering itself for the arrival it would make whether he wanted it to or not. He had always loved that moment, the cockpit cracking open into morning over a city, the specific feeling of arriving. Tonight it looked less like arrival and more like being delivered. 2.5 hours into the flight, the Atlantic was at its most absolute beneath them. No coastline visible, no landmark in the darkness below or above. Just the plane and the stars and the vast, indifferent geography of open ocean and the first-class cabin of Liberty Atlantic. 227 had achieved the particular suspension of a place that has been through something and is waiting without quite knowing it for whatever comes next. Naomi sat with Meditations open on her lap, and her eyes on the same page she had been returning to for the past 40 minutes. She was not reading. She was with great discipline and precision thinking, turning over the variables, arranging the facts. She had assessing what she had and what she needed and when the right time was and what the right action looked like when it arrived. This was what 12 years of operational work had given her above all else. Not fearlessness, because she had never believed in fearlessness, but the ability to remain present and clear and functional inside a situation while it was still moving, while the outcome was still unwritten. Priya appeared from the galley and walked to her row, not with the careful apologetic crouching of before, but with her spine straight and a directness in her step that was new. She stopped beside Naomi's seat and said in a quiet and different voice, "Is there anything I can do?" It was a different question from before. Before had been an apology looking for absolution. This was a genuine inquiry. Naomi studied her for a moment. In Priya's face she saw someone who was in the middle of becoming someone right now in real time on this flight, and who had not quite completed the transition, but who was clearly committed to it. "Do your job well for the rest of this flight," Naomi said. "All of it. Do it exactly as you know it should be done, and remember everything you've seen tonight." Priya nodded. She held eye contact for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, which was a choice, and then she turned and walked back toward the galley, and as she walked she took the small crew notepad from her apron pocket and uncapped the pen she kept clipped beside it. Naomi watched her go. In 3B, the bourbon man had stopped drinking and had placed his glass to the side and was sitting in the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and is getting closer to a decision about it. The pearl-earring woman in 1A had pulled a pen from her bag 20 minutes ago and had been writing in a small journal ever since, slowly, with the careful handwriting of someone who is composing something rather than merely recording it. The teenager in 4A had both earbuds out now and was sitting with his phone resting on his tray, not touching it, just sitting with it as if its presence were a reminder of a choice he hadn't made yet. Walter Osei leaned slightly toward her. It was a small movement, a degree or two of inclination, nothing that would read from across the aisle as anything more than someone adjusting their posture, but it was clearly intentional, and Naomi turned her head toward him. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed," he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice of a man who is used to saying exactly what he means and has long stopped padding his sentences with unnecessary buffer. "Sometimes grace is the best armor," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead, not at her. "I have been the only person who looked like me in the room for the better part of 30 years, he said. "In different rooms, different countries, different industries. And I have learned that there are two kinds of composure. The kind that cost you everything to maintain, and the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, and deciding that no one else gets to write that story." He paused. "What I saw tonight was the second kind." She didn't answer right away. She let the words settle. Then she said, "It helped to have a witness." He made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something warm adjacent to it, and he returned his eyes to his newspaper, and Naomi returned to her book, and the exchange was over, and had taken perhaps 90 seconds, and had been one of the most substantial conversations she'd had in months. Then the cockpit door opened. The cabin registered it immediately. A collective adjustment in the air, a stiffening and attention that had been distributed suddenly concentrating toward a single point. Hollis came through with a different bearing than his last two entries. He was quieter, which was worse. The aggression had reorganized itself into something that wore the clothes of reason. And reason that is actually aggression is harder to counter because it forces you to argue with its framing rather than its content. He stopped at row 2. He said in a voice calibrated to measured concern, "Dr. Carter, I apologize for the disruption this evening. I've been informed by a member of the cabin that a formal complaint has been raised about your behavior during our last interaction. For the comfort of other passengers, I'm going to need to ask you to relocate to an alternate seat." "That's not accurate," the pearl earring woman said. She said it simply, without drama, in the crisp tone of someone correcting a factual error in a meeting. She was still holding her pen. She looked at Hollis with the composed directness of someone who has decided to be in this and said, "I am a passenger in this cabin, and I have been awake and present throughout this flight, and I have not witnessed any behavior from 2B that would warrant a complaint." Hollis looked at her. The manufactured reasonableness in his face was straining at its seams. "I appreciate that," he began. "Where is the complaint?" Walter Osei asked from 3A. Not loudly. Simply. Hollis turned to him. "If a formal complaint has been registered," Osei continued, "there is a specific procedure, a written record, a crew member as intermediary. None of that has occurred." He looked at Hollis with the patience of someone who has been in enough institutional settings to know when procedure is being improvised. "So I'll ask again, where is the complaint?" In the galley doorway, Priya had appeared. She was standing with her notepad in her hand, and she did not speak. She simply stood there, visible present, which was a choice that was not nothing. In 4A, the teenager had picked up his phone. The bourbon man had turned fully in his seat. Hollis looked at his cabin and found it looking back at him, and the look it was giving him was not the look of a space that recognized his authority. It was something older and less comfortable than the look of people who have decided collectively and without coordination that they are done being uninvested. He put his hand on the headrest of the seat beside Naomi's. A gripping gesture, a claiming of territory, and the moment it happened, Naomi felt the calculation complete itself inside her with the quiet finality of an equation resolving. She thought of the broken ID in her bag. She thought of her mother in a Baltimore hallway, 1986, bringing a child into the world on a gurney because someone behind a desk had decided to spend their authority on the wrong side of a question. She thought of a Daeze Nwosu in a hallway at DHS 14 years ago. Real power never needs to announce itself, but it knows when to stand up. She stood up. The movement was fluid and unhurried and completely without theatrics, the movement of someone who has decided something and is now simply acting on it. The book slid from her lap to the tray table open to the underlined passage. Her hand went into her bag. Every eye in the first-class cabin followed her, and the cabin held its breath, and for a moment the only sound in the entire aircraft was the steady, indifferent hum of the engines at cruising altitude. She did not look at Hollis. Not yet. She turned to face the cabin, the full width of it all, the rows, all the watching faces, and she stood in the aisle of seat 2B with the stillness of someone who has decided how this scene ends and is giving it the time it deserves. Her left hand moved inside the open bag without urgency, without searching, because her fingers knew exactly where to go past the lip balm, past the travel ibuprofen to the small black leather case that was always in the same place, had been in the same place for 12 years. The case she had never been careless with and had never needed more than she needed it now. A thumb flick. The case opened. The overhead light of seat 2B warm amber, the cabin lighting of a long-haul flight, caught the badge and held it, and for a moment the gold of the Department of Homeland Security seal was the only bright thing in the front section of the aircraft. The eagle's wings spanned wide across the face of the badge, and beside it, in the credential window, her photograph looked out with the composed steadiness of someone who had known, when it was taken 3 years ago in a government building in Washington, that it would need to mean something one day. Beneath the photograph, in block letters that required no squinting, no examination, no theatrical deliberation, Federal Special Agent. She let the cabin see it. She gave it 3 full seconds, not for drama, for record, so that the image would be complete and clear and retrievable in the memory of every person present. And then she spoke. "Special Agent Dr. Naomi Carter," she said, and her voice was not raised, not theatrical, not performing anything except the simple act of stating facts with the precision they required. "Department of Homeland Security, Federal Investigations Division." She paused exactly 1 beat. "Captain Hollis has, in the presence of multiple witnesses, willfully destroyed federal identification issued to an active-duty federal agent. He has done this following a pattern of repeated and public harassment without cause and following statements made to this agent that I am prepared to recite verbatim in a federal filing." The pearl-earring woman's hand went to her mouth. Walter Osei placed his newspaper on the tray table with a quiet, final exactness, and he did not pick it up again. The bourbon man's glass was suspended halfway between the table and his lips, and it stayed there for a long moment before he set it down with the careful slowness of someone who has just understood the gravity of the room he is in. The teenager's phone was up, not pointed, just up, angled in the general direction of the aisle, the screen glowing in the amber light. Behind her, further down the cabin, the murmur of people who had been listening through the thin barrier of deliberately maintained inattention had stopped murmuring, and there was instead a silence of the kind that happens when a group of people reach the same realization at the same moment, and the weight of it briefly prevents any of them from making a sound. Hollis stood in the aisle, and his face did the thing faces do when the story a person has been constructing for hours meets the unambiguous structure of reality and discovers that it does not fit. His hand left the headrest. The smile which he had been maintaining as a kind of armor, a persistence of professional composure that had been serving as his last claim to authority, dissolved not gradually but completely the way a held breath releases. His eyes moved to the badge, then to her face. Then, with the instinct of a man suddenly aware of his exposure to the cabin around him, to the pearl-earring woman, to Walter Osei, to the teenager with his phone, to Priya, standing in the galley doorway with her notepad open and her pen moving. He was seeing the room for the first time as it actually was not his domain. Not a space where his uniform was the final argument, but a room full of witnesses. Naomi looked toward the cockpit. First Officer Reeve had appeared in the doorway. He had come out at the sound of her voice, or perhaps at the badge, or perhaps at the weight of the silence itself, and he stood there with the expression of a man who has been waiting without knowing he was waiting for this particular moment to arrive. "First Officer Reeve," she said, and her voice remained level and clear and entirely without heat. "I am requesting that you formally notify airline operations and London Air Traffic Control of this incident in accordance with federal protocol for interference with a federal agent on a commercial flight. I am further requesting that you confirm for the record whether you have been the sole operational pilot during the period in which Captain Hollis has been absent from the flight deck." Reeves' jaw moved slightly. He had clearly rehearsed this in his own way, had known on some level that it was coming, and had prepared himself for the reality of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the steadiness in his voice was the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is standing in it. "That's correct. I've been primary since before the second departure from the cockpit," Hollis said. Something started a sentence, a word the beginning of an interruption, and Naomi raised her hand palm forward, a gesture so quiet and so complete that it closed his mouth the way a door closes when the latch catches. She turned to Priya. "The sealed bag," she said. Priya moved immediately, not hurrying, not fumbling, but with a directness that was the physical expression of the decision she had been making since Hollis cracked the plastic and the cabin had gone silent. She reached into her apron and produced the small, sealable bag with the 2 broken pieces of the driver's license inside it, and she held it out to Naomi with both hands and said, "Here. I also have everything documented times exact statements my position relative to the aisle." She held up the notepad briefly. 3 pages. "Thank you," Naomi said, and she took the bag and placed it into her handbag and zipped it shut. Then she straightened and held the badge one more time, not for Hollis, not for herself, for the record, for the memory of every person in this cabin who would carry what they saw tonight with them, and do something with it eventually, even if they didn't know yet what that something was. "Let the record of this flight show," she said, and her voice was very calm now, the calm of the end of something rather than the beginning, that this cabin has been witness to a federal incident, that evidence has been secured, and that the appropriate notifications will be made upon landing. She looked at Reeve. "Proceed with your landing protocols, First Officer." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Hollis one last time. He was standing in the aisle of his aircraft with his hands at his sides and his silver wings on his chest catching the amber light and his thick blonde hair slightly disordered from the hand he'd run through it. And he looked not dangerous, not defiant, not any of the things he had looked for the preceding 2 hours. He looked simply small in the way that people look small when the version of themselves they have been performing is no longer available to them and what's underneath is not enough to fill the space. She said nothing to him. She did not need to. She turned and she walked back to seat 2B, and she sat down and she crossed her legs and she opened Meditations to the page that had been waiting for her, and the cabin exhaled. Hollis stood in the aisle for a moment longer. One more moment. The last moment of a man clinging to a room that has already stopped recognizing him, and then he turned and walked back to the cockpit, and the door closed behind him, and the sound of it was the sound of something ending. The cockpit felt different to Derek Hollis now. It had always been the one space on Earth where he was unambiguously himself. The command chair, the glowing instruments, the windscreen opening onto whatever sky had been assigned to him that day, and for 23 years it had been enough. More than enough. It had been the proof of everything he believed about himself, that he had earned his place in the world, that the space between him and the ground was territory he had mastered through genuine excellence and accumulated hours and a real and serious dedication to the craft of flying. He came back through the cockpit door and found Reeve already on the radio with London Center, and the tail end of the conversation he heard was not the tail end of a position report. "Confirm law enforcement presence at gate. Internal protocol incident. Copy." Hollis stood at the back of the cockpit and listened to the London controller's crisp acknowledgement and understood, in the sudden full-body way of a man who has finally run out of room to tell himself a different story, exactly what it meant. There would be people waiting on the ground, not airline staff with concerned expressions and careful HR language. People with authority that superseded his own people who would have read something by the time the wheels touched down, who would have a file and a procedure and a patience that did not depend on his cooperation. He sat down in the jump seat. He did not try to reclaim the command chair. That was not a conscious decision. It was simply what his body did, and the body sometimes knows before the mind does that a certain kind of authority has expired. Reeve did not turn around. He continued through his checklist with the focused attention of a man whose job required precision and who was giving it. Every item checked every reading, verified every communication made with the clean, professional cadence that the job required. He did not need Hollis for any of it. He had not needed Hollis for any of it since the second time Hollis had left the cockpit, and both of them understood this now. James Hollis said. Reeve checked an instrument. "James, we've flown this route together 70 times. 74, Reeve said without turning. Then you know me. You know what kind of pilot I am, what kind of captain. You know that what happened back there, I know what I heard Reeve said. I know what I've been hearing for 6 years in smaller versions that I've been choosing not to look at directly. He made an adjustment to the console. I'm looking at it directly now. Hollis sat back. His hands rested on his thighs with a flatness that spoke of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of long hours, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding up a version of himself that has just collapsed. His silver wings, which he had clipped to his uniform jacket this morning in a hotel mirror in Washington with the unconscious pride of a gesture repeated so many times, it had become reflex, caught the console light and looked back at him as evidence. He ran his hand through his thick blonde hair once, then again, and the gesture had none of its earlier authority. It was the gesture of someone who doesn't know where to put their hands. Through the windscreen ahead, the darkness of the Atlantic was beginning to give way at the far edge. Not sunrise yet, that was still an hour off, but the quality of the black had changed, a subtle relenting at the horizon, the first suggestion of a sky that was preparing to become something. London was out there building itself up from nothing into an approaching certainty. He had landed here dozens of times. He knew the approach by memory, the specific geography of the descent. The feel of the altitude changes the sequence of lights below that told you exactly where you were. He had always found it satisfying the way a complex and demanding thing becomes elegant through repetition and mastery. Now he pressed his palm against the side window and looked at the distant glow without recognition, the way you look at a familiar face that has been rearranged by something you did. "Requesting approach clearance," Reeve said into his headset, his voice clear and even. He followed it with the deviation isolated hard-stand law enforcement confirmation. Standard protocol for incident disclosure, and London Center responded with the brisk professional acknowledgement of an organization that has handled this before because this is not the first time a commercial flight has arrived with a situation that required more than a gate and a baggage belt. Hollis closed his eyes. He heard every word of the exchange with the clarity of a man who understands finally that understanding does not help him anymore. "Don't let them take my license," he said, and the words came out stripped of the authority that had inhabited every sentence he had spoken for the past 2 hours, and what was left was something smaller and more honestly human, not sympathetic but recognizable. The voice of a man confronting loss. "James, please." Reeve read from the descent checklist. His voice did not waver. He called each item and confirmed each response with the mechanical precision of someone who has decided that the most important thing he can do right now is the thing the job requires, and the job requires this, and he is going to do it exactly right. He did not answer. Below them, the lights of the English coast had begun to appear, scattered at first, then more concentrated, then suddenly the unmistakable density of a city at night. The Thames, a black ribbon cutting through the gold. Reeve took the aircraft down through the cloud layer with steady hands, and the ride was smooth, and the instruments were clean, and the plane descended toward London with the same indifferent competence it always had, because the machine did not care about the story of the men inside it. It only cared about the physics, and the physics were fine. It was everything else that was landing hard. In the final 30 minutes of Liberty Atlantic, 227's crossing, the first-class cabin of the aircraft experienced something that had no name in the airline's operational manual, but that every person present would carry with them in one form or another for a very long time. The specific weight of having watched something happen and having made each in their own way a choice about it. The pearl-earring woman whose name was Constance, who was 61 years old and was a retired federal judge traveling to London for her niece's wedding, had her small leather journal open on her tray table and was writing in it with the deliberate care of someone who understood that memory is unreliable and documentation is not. She was writing times, positions, exact sentences as closely as she could reconstruct them. the kind of record that comes naturally to someone whose professional life had been built on the understanding that what people remember and what actually happened are frequently different, and that the difference matters enormously. She wrote without looking up, and when Priya walked past, she flagged her quietly and asked, "Is there a process for submitting a passenger witness statement to the airline directly?" Priya said, "Yes, ma'am," and returned from the galley with a form she had found in the operations binder and a pen, and she placed them on the tray table beside the journal. "Thank you," Constance said, and returned to writing. Across the aisle in 3B, the bourbon man whose name was Richard, who was a partner at an insurance firm in the city and had been on this route every other week for 2 years, had not ordered another drink. He was sitting with his laptop closed and his hands folded on the table, doing what appeared from the outside to be nothing but what was from the inside the not entirely comfortable business of accounting for himself. He had been awake during both confrontations. He had heard the sound of the ID being broken. He had looked at his laptop. He had told himself it wasn't his business in a way that had not fully convinced him even at the time and was convincing him less with each passing minute. When Priya came through with the passenger forms, he reached out without being prompted and took one. In 4A, the teenager Marcus's age, 17, traveling alone for the first time to visit his grandfather in South London, had been sitting with his phone since the badge reveal with the particular paralysis of someone who has material they know matters and is deciding what to do with it. He had 12 seconds of video that he had not started recording on purpose, but that had been running from the moment he placed his phone face up on the tray and forgotten to turn it off. The video showed the aisle from a slightly low angle, but it showed Hollis's hands on the ID, and it showed the brake, and it showed the cabinet of the cabin in the seconds after. He watched it 4 times. Then he turned to Priya as she passed and said, "Is there somewhere I can send this?" Priya looked at the screen. Her expression moved through several phases in rapid succession. She said, "Yes. I'll connect you with the operations team on the ground." Walter Osei sat with his newspaper fully folded and did not open it again for the remainder of the flight. He was looking out his window at the approach lights of London materializing below the organized geometry of them, the patient, reliable pattern of a city that had been guiding aircraft home for many decades. And he was not thinking about any one particular thing, but was instead doing what people sometimes do after a significant event, which is simply being present in the body, simply existing in the moment after letting the weight of it settle, without trying to translate it immediately into meaning. When Naomi stood up to relieve herself 40 minutes before landing, she passed his row, and he looked up from the window, and they made eye contact for a moment, and he said nothing, and she said nothing. And then she moved on, and when she came back and passed his row again, he had his hand resting on the aisle armrest with his palm facing upward, in a gesture so minimal it could have been anything. And she touched the back of 2 fingers to his palm, the briefest possible contact, and kept walking, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. In the forward galley, Priya stood with her back to the curtain and her notepad open and 3 pages of careful time-stamped documentation in her own handwriting, covering everything from the first confrontation to the second, to the sound of the plastic breaking to the exact words of Naomi's credential statement, to the positions of each crew member and the responses of specific passengers. She was a second-year flight attendant. She had wanted to be a flight attendant because she liked the idea of being part of the infrastructure that moved people from one version of their life to another, and she had believed when she started that most of the work was technical and emotional in a manageable way. She had not expected at 26 to be standing in a galley over the Atlantic at 4 a.m, having made the most significant professional decision of her career by writing everything down. She capped the pen. She looked at the notepad. She thought about Hollis in the cockpit and about the 6 months she had flown under his command, and about the small things she had noticed and not named, and about the specific quality of his voice when he spoke to passengers like Naomi versus passengers like the Bourbon Man. She had not named those things. She was naming them now on the pages of a crew notepad in her own hand in ink. She tucked the notepad into her inner jacket pocket where she would keep it until the ground. Naomi sat in seat 2B with her book open and her sparkling water finally finished. She had drunk it in the last 20 minutes, along with a small cup of warm tea that Priya had brought without being asked, and she was looking out the window at London assembling itself below the cloud line. The city looked from this altitude like a circuit board, millions of points of light organized into patterns that implied intelligence, that implied someone had planned all of this. Though of course no one had, it had simply grown according to its own pressure and history and need sprawling outward from its center, the way things do when they are alive. She opened her satellite phone and spent 30 seconds on a coded call to the DHS field contact in Washington Mission on schedule ground support, confirmed incident documentation being handled at multiple levels, and then she closed the phone and placed it back in her bag. She picked up Meditations one more time. She found the underlined passage. She read it. You have power over your mind, not outside events. She had been reading that line for 4 years. Tonight it had become something new, not a reminder, not an anchor, but a fact she had proven. A thing she had demonstrated under conditions she had not chosen and could not have predicted to 12 witnesses at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic. The wheels of the aircraft found the runway and touched it with a gentleness that surprised her given everything. The plane landed with a smoothness that had nothing to do with the condition of the people inside it. The aircraft simply continuing to perform its function with the unbothered competence of a machine. And then instead of turning right toward the main terminal complex, it turned left, following the blinking yellow lights of a follow-me vehicle that led them out across the cold tarmac toward a remote hard stand on the eastern side of the field where the early morning fog sat in thin layers and the terminal lights were distant and softened. The passengers at the windows saw what was waiting. 2 black sedans with their engines running. A dark blue van bearing a government crest on its side panel. 4 figures in dark coats standing in a line with the particular stillness of people who have been briefed and are ready and are not there by accident. The murmur that moved through the cabin was not dramatic. It was the low collective sound of people seeing the consequence of a thing they had witnessed and understanding in the seeing of it that consequences are real, and that tonight they had been present for one. Reeve brought the aircraft to its assigned position, powered down the engines with the procedural exactness that the shutdown checklist required, and set the parking brake with a clean final click that carried through the quiet cockpit. He said into the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at London Heathrow. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is extinguished, and you have been given further instructions from the crew." His voice was steady and professional, and gave nothing away, which was its own kind of dignity. In the jump seat, Hollis sat without moving. He had been sitting without moving for the better part of an hour. His hands were on his thighs. His eyes were forward. He was not looking at the figures waiting outside on the tarmac, but he knew they were there because he had heard Reeves' communication with London Center, and because he understood aviation protocol and operational procedure well enough to know exactly what an isolated hard stand with law enforcement confirmation meant for the person who had made it necessary. He had run his hand through his thick blonde hair so many times since the badge reveal that it was no longer quite straight. It sat at a slight angle, pushed back from his forehead in a way that looked less like style and more like evidence of a long and losing internal battle. Naomi stood, took her bag, and walked to the forward galley. She moved without hurry. Priya was already there, the notepad secured in her jacket, the sealed bag with the ID fragments in her hand. She handed it to Naomi without a word. Naomi placed it in her bag. Then she said calmly, "I'll need the cockpit." Priya moved aside. Naomi walked the 3 steps to the cockpit door and opened it. She stepped inside and stood in the narrow space between the 2 seats and the instrument panel, and the cockpit felt small in the specific way of rooms that contain something that has collapsed. Reeve stood immediately by instinct or by the choice of a man who understood the appropriate posture for this moment, and moved past her into the cabin with a quiet, "All yours, Agent Carter." Hollis did not stand. He looked up at her from the jump seat, and his face was the face of a man at the very end of his narrative. Not frightened, not defiant, just emptied of the architecture that had held it in its familiar shape. His eyes moved over her and found nothing to challenge and nowhere to land. "Don't do this," he said. His voice had the quality of something scraped clean. Naomi stood in the cockpit of his aircraft and looked at him without performance and without malice and with absolute clarity, and said, "You did this. You did it every time you decided that what you thought you saw mattered more than what was actually in front of you. You did it when you left this cockpit the first time and the second time and the third. You did it when you bent that plastic between your fingers and decided that breaking my identification was a thing you had the right to do." She paused 1 beat. "You made choices, each one. And this is where choices land." He blinked. His mouth moved. Nothing came. "They're here," Priya said from the doorway. The main cabin door opened, and the London morning came in cold gray smelling of fuel and fog, and then the footsteps on the metal stairs, and then the tall man in the dark coat stepping into the forward galley, presenting credentials with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times. He looked at Naomi. She confirmed. He made a small nod to the 2 who followed him. One of them was carrying a thin folder. Hollis stood slowly. He straightened his jacket. He reached up to his left breast where his silver wings were pinned, and he stopped his hand resting over them for a moment without unpinning them, as if he were not sure whether this was the last time or whether there was still something left to claim. And then he dropped his hand and left them there, and walked out. He came through the cabin, and the passengers watched him and said nothing, not because they had nothing to say, but because there are moments when silence is the most complete statement available. He did not look at any of them. He kept his eyes forward and his chin level with the residual pride of a man who is still trying to perform dignity in the ruins of it, and he walked to the cabin door and down the air stairs and out onto the cold tarmac. He paused at the bottom, just for a moment at the foot of the stairs, with the London fog around him and the sedan door open 10 feet away. He stood there in the way of someone waiting for something. A word, a hand on the shoulder, a version of events that would give him somewhere else to stand, and it didn't come. The sedan door closed behind him with a sound that was final and quiet, and utterly without sentiment. Inside the cabin, Naomi returned to seat 2B. She sat down. She adjusted the angle of her tray table. She said to Priya, "You can begin disembarkation." Then she opened her bag, took out her reporting tablet, and began to prepare for what came next. She was the last to leave the aircraft. She descended the air stairs into the Heathrow morning with her bag over one shoulder and her tablet under her arm, and the fog on the tarmac was thicker down here than it had appeared from the window. It clung to the concrete and the fuselage and the distant outlines of the ground crews' vehicles in thin white layers that softened everything at the edges. A waiting official in a dark coat met her at the bottom of the stairs, reviewed her credentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been briefed on exactly who she was and why this particular aircraft had arrived at a remote hardstand at 5:40 in the morning rather than at a gate, and confirmed that transport to the consulate was ready and waiting. She nodded, offered a quiet thanks, and stepped into the black SUV that was idling nearby with its windows darkened. The door closed. The vehicle began to move across the outer tarmac and through the rear window. She watched the aircraft receding in the fog, its familiar shape, its tail markings the ordinary exterior of a thing that had been for the past several hours the location of something far from ordinary. She looked away. In a holding area inside Terminal 3, Priya Nair sat in a gray institutional chair with a paper cup of bitter tea in both hands and the notepad in her jacket pocket, and the specific stillness of someone who has been questioned and debriefed and instructed to wait and is now simply being present inside the consequence of the choice they made. A colleague from another flight, someone she had trained with whose locker was next to hers in the crew facility, came and sat beside her and said, without preamble, "Are you okay?" Priya thought about it for a moment before answering, which was more than she usually did with that question. "I think I am," she said. "I keep thinking about how long I knew something was off. How many times I smoothed things over." Her colleague was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, "But you didn't this time." "No," Priya said. "I didn't." She looked at her tea. "That's going to have to be enough." On the other side of the terminal, Walter Osei moved through the arrivals corridor with the unhurried ease of a man whose driver was waiting and whose day was organized and who had, as he always did, arrived exactly where he had intended. He paused briefly at a newsstand. The early editions of the morning papers were just going up. Nothing yet about the flight the story hadn't broken, and he picked up the Financial Times, the same paper he had been reading when the flight began, and he stood there for a moment with it in his hand. Then he placed it back on the rack and walked on. He didn't need it. He had been present for the real thing. In the cockpit, empty, now cleaned out by the ground crew beginning their post-flight procedures, James Reeve sat alone for 10 minutes before leaving. He sat in the command seat, the one that Hollis had not occupied for the last 3 hours of the flight, and he looked at the instrument panel and the blank windscreen and the organized silence of a cockpit at rest, and he thought about 6 years of small decisions. 6 years of averted eyes. 6 years of being aware that the man he flew with had a particular quality in certain situations, a particular way of moving through the cabin when certain passengers were seated in certain rows and having found reasons each time not to name it directly to himself or to anyone else. He thought about Naomi Carter standing in the aisle with a federal badge and a voice that carried without being raised, and about what it had cost her to hold herself exactly as she had held herself throughout that flight. He thought about the discipline of that. He thought about what he would have been doing if he had been in her seat instead of his. He picked up his phone and called home. His wife answered on the 3rd ring. It was early, but she always woke when he called from an overseas arrival, and she asked, as she always did, how the flight was. "Long," he said, "but I think it went the right way." He paused. "I'll tell you when I get home." In Manhattan, it was just past midnight, and Liberty Atlantic board chair Margaret Voss had been awake for 2 hours and was going to be awake for many more. The leaked photograph Hollis on the tarmac face, half-turned, flanked by 2 figures in dark coats, had been circulating in private industry forums since 4 a.m. London time, and the first media inquiry had arrived at the airline's communications office at 12:10 a.m. Eastern, followed by 3 more within 20 minutes. She had read the incident report once and then she had called legal and compliance and public communications and told them all to get to the Midtown office. She called Naomi at 6 a.m. London time. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "This is Carter," Naomi said. "This is Margaret Voss," said the voice on the other end, polished, measured the voice of a woman who had been the chair of a major airline for 7 years and had never made a call like this before and knew it. "I've read everything. I want to speak to you directly, without staff, without intermediary. I believe we owe you not a statement, but a change." Naomi was standing at a window in the consulate looking at London going about its morning under a low gray sky. "I appreciate you calling," she said. "I want you to understand something before we go further, Miss Voss. I'm not interested in managing this. I'm interested in it being addressed honestly, not for my benefit, but because this is not about one flight or one captain. It's about a pattern of behavior that your airline permitted to continue long past the point where it should have been stopped, and that stopping it now fully and with real structural change rather than a press release is the only outcome worth discussing. There was a pause on the other end. "I know," Margaret Voss said, and her voice had lost some of its careful polish and sounded for a moment like the voice of a person rather than a title. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. And exactly what I know we need to do." The call lasted 40 minutes. The consulate's secured briefing room was a spare practical space, a long table, 8 chairs, a window overlooking a courtyard where the morning fog was beginning to lift, and Deputy Director Alan Foote sat at the far end of it with 2 manila folders open in front of him, and the expression of a man who had read something that confirmed what he had already suspected, and did not find the confirmation satisfying. He was compact and precise with the unhurried manner of someone who had been in intelligence work long enough to know that urgency and impatience were different things, and that most situations benefited from treating them that way. He had flown overnight from Washington when the alert came through which said more about the seriousness of the situation than any words he could have used. Naomi sat across from him. She had changed into a fresh jacket from her carry-on and had taken 30 minutes in the consulate bathroom to drink a glass of water and sit in silence and let the previous 8 hours settle into something she could work with. She was tired in a deep way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of having held yourself exactly right under conditions designed to make holding yourself exactly right as difficult and costly as possible. "Your authority was valid," Foote said, which was the beginning rather than the conclusion. "Your restraint was commendable. Your documentation through you and through the flight attendant is comprehensive." He closed one of the folders. "What concerns me, and I want to be direct with you, is the pattern." "Tell me about the pattern," Naomi said. He opened the second folder and turned it to face her. She looked at the names and dates and incident numbers arranged in rows and read it with the focused attention of someone who is receiving a piece of information they had already half prepared themselves for but whose full weight still lands. 3 prior complaints. Different passengers. Different routes. All involving first-class cabins. All involving passengers who looked like Naomi. All quietly closed, not pursued, filed as resolved through crew mediation. The oldest was from 4 years ago. The most recent was from 7 months ago, which meant it predated every single one of the flight hours Priya Nair had logged under Hollis's command. "How many times?" she said. 3 documented, Foote said. "We have reason to believe the actual number is higher." He paused. "You were the first person who didn't accept the mediation resolution and move on." Naomi sat with that for a moment. She thought about the other passengers, the 3 in the files, and the ones who weren't in the files, sitting in first-class cabins on other flights, on other days being handed resolution, and accepting it because they were traveling, because they had jobs to get to, because fighting takes a kind of capacity that sometimes you simply don't have left. And because the machinery of a large institution is very good at making individuals feel that they are the outlier, the difficult one, the single data point that doesn't justify the disruption of the whole. 3 senior members of the airline's operations board were on this flight, Foote said. They'll be in New York before noon. I don't think there's a version of this that stays quiet. "I'm not trying to keep it quiet," Naomi said. He looked at her with the measured attention of someone making a final assessment. "I know," he said. "That's why I flew overnight." He closed the second folder. "Your London briefing is confirmed for 3 o'clock. I'll have a full report to the director by end of day. Everything else, the airline, the investigation, the follow-through that machinery is now running. You did your job. Let it run." She nodded. He pushed a document across the table, a 1-page incident summary, requiring her signature, the first of many she would sign in the coming days. She read it fully as she always did and signed it and pushed it back. One more thing, she said. The flight attendant, Priya Nair. She documented everything on her own initiative. 3 pages of time-stamped witness notes. Make sure that's part of the record. Foote noted it. It will be. Naomi stood. She picked up her bag. She looked out the window at the courtyard, where the fog had mostly lifted now and a pale London sun was making its first tentative appearance against the gray. He told me, she said almost to herself, that at 30,000 feet, there's nowhere to hide who you really are. Foote looked at her. He was right, she said. Just not about the person he thought he was describing. By 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Liberty Atlantic's Midtown Manhattan headquarters had the electric quality of a building that has understood it is in the middle of something and does not yet know how big the something is. The executive floor was lit in every office. The coffee in the kitchen had been made twice and drunk twice. Security had quietly activated the building's media management protocols, which meant the lobby desk was already fielding calls. It was not authorized to confirm or deny. Margaret Voss had been at her desk since 4:30. She was 62 years old, had chaired the airline's board for 7 years following 15 years in aviation operations management, and had handled her share of crises, the kind that come from weather and mechanical failure and the ordinary disasters of a business that puts aircraft in the sky every hour of every day. She was not unfamiliar with pressure. But she had spent the past 3 hours looking at a photograph of Derek Hollis being walked across a Heathrow tarmac by 2 government officials. And the photograph was doing something to her that weather crises had not done, which was making her feel personally responsible in a way that she was only now beginning to understand. She should have felt 7 months ago when a complaint came across her desk and was routed to crew mediation before she had finished reading it. She did not say this to legal or to communications or to the compliance director who sat across from her now with a folder full of documents that he had clearly pulled from archives at some speed. She sat with it privately and let it do what it needed to do. 3 prior incidents, the compliance director said. I'm aware, she said. All resolved through I know how they were resolved. She said it without heat, which was more uncomfortable for him than if she had said it with heat. I want to understand how they were resolved in a way that kept them out of any record I saw, and I want to understand that before I speak to anyone outside this room. He opened the folder and walked her through it. The resolutions had been standard crew mediation airline credit non-disclosure forms in 2 cases. No formal review of Hollis's conduct, no flag added to his personnel file, no escalation to operations leadership. In each case, the machinery had done exactly what it was designed to do, which was contain the complaint at the lowest available level with the least possible disruption to operations. The problem was that the machinery had been designed not deliberately, not through a single decision, but through years of accumulated process and preference to work that way. The problem was that resolve and move on was in practice a policy. Nobody had written it down. Nobody had approved it in a meeting. It had simply become the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance tends to become the default path, and the default path tends to become, in time, the only path anyone can see. Voss knew this. She had built her career on understanding organizational behavior, on reading the culture of institutions the way others read financial reports. She had simply not applied that understanding to this particular corner of this particular institution. And the reason she had not was a question she was going to have to sit with for a long time. The call to Naomi had lasted 40 minutes. Voss had listened more than she had spoken, which was not her habit, but which was the right instinct in this case. She had offered what she could, a genuine acknowledgement, a commitment to structural review, an invitation that Naomi had accepted with conditions that were reasonable and serious. When the call ended, she had sat for 10 minutes in silence before calling her assistant and beginning the work of an announcement. The public statement that went out at 9 a.m. Eastern was short. It acknowledged the incident. It confirmed Hollis's termination effective immediately with a full investigation into his conduct record. It announced an independent audit of the airline's complaint resolution processes to be overseen by an external panel. It committed to a comprehensive review of training and cultural standards across the airline's crew and management hierarchy. It did not use the word mistake. Voss had taken that word out herself in the third draft because it was the wrong word. A mistake was a single event. What this was had been building for a long time, and she was not going to summarize it in a word that let the institution off the hook for the building. The response was immediate and voluminous. The legal team began fielding media requests. The communications team began managing the digital response. Compliance began pulling records for the audit. The machinery that had been built to contain things was now with some significant dismantling and reassembly being directed to expose them instead. It was not enough. Voss knew it was not enough that a statement and an investigation and a commitment to review were the beginning of accountability and not its completion, and that the distance between beginning and completion was measured in years and in the kind of sustained institutional will that was harder to maintain than it was to announce. She knew all of this. She was going to do it anyway, because Naomi Carter had told her at the beginning of a 40-minute phone call from a consulate room in London. This isn't about a PR fix. It's about a reckoning. And Voss had said, I know. That's exactly what we need. She had meant it. The room they put him in at Heathrow was technically a law enforcement waiting area, which meant it had the institutional character of all such rooms. Fluorescent lighting, a table with a water carafe, 4 chairs, a clock on the wall that was slightly off 2 minutes fast or 2 minutes slow. He had already lost track of which way the error ran. Derek Hollis sat in one of the chairs and did not move for a long time. His uniform was still on. He had not been able to bring himself to remove it, which he understood was irrational, because the uniform was not doing anything for him in this room, and had not been doing anything for him since the moment the sedan door closed on the tarmac. But the act of removing it felt like something he was not ready to do. A threshold he could not yet cross, and so he left it on, and sat with it on, and looked at the wall. His phone was on the table in front of him. It had received 6 calls since his arrival in the room, 2 from his wife. Her name appeared twice in the missed call list, the second call coming 13 minutes after the first, which told its own story. 2 from his attorney, 1 from a colleague at the airline whose name he had worked alongside for 11 years, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize, which might have been the union representative he had requested, or might have been someone else entirely, and it no longer seemed to matter which. He did not pick up the phone. He looked at the silver wings on his jacket instead. They had been there for 23 years, different jackets, same wings always in the same position on the left breast, always polished, before a transatlantic, a ritual so old it had become invisible. The thing you did before flying the way you checked the weather automatically, without having to think about why. He had earned them through years of genuine work and genuine skill and a real and serious love for the specific discipline of flying, and none of that was false, and none of that had been taken from him by what happened on the flight, and none of that made what happened on the flight acceptable. And he was sitting in this room with all 3 of those things true at the same time, and finding no way to arrange them that helped. He reached up with his right hand. He closed his fingers around the wings and unpinned them slowly, working the clasp with the careful attention of someone who is aware that the gesture is irreversible. He held them in his palm for a moment. They were lighter than they felt when they were on, lighter than they had always seemed, the way things you have carried for a long time feel lighter once you are holding them than they felt when they were part of you. He set them on the table beside the phone. He did not reach for either of them again. He looked at the clock on the wall, slightly wrong in either direction, and he sat with his hands in his lap and the fluorescent light overhead and the weight of the quiet room. And he thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, and the morning moved around him indifferently, as mornings do. The London briefing had gone 3 hours. The intelligence counterparts from British services had been thorough and prepared, and had received everything she had brought with the focused seriousness of people who understood the stakes and had their own reasons to take them seriously. The work was done, the actual work. The work that had been the real reason for the flight, the purpose around which everything else had arranged itself without her choosing it, and she walked out of the consulate building into the London late afternoon with the specific quality of tiredness that comes not from having failed, but from having fully spent yourself in the direction of something that mattered. The city was doing what London does in the late afternoon in late autumn, which is producing a light that is somehow both pale and golden. At the same time, the sun hanging low over the rooftops, and the Thames visible between buildings in brief flat glimpses, the streets full of people moving with the purposeful drift of a city that has been doing exactly this for a long time and expects to keep doing it. She took a taxi to the hotel rather than the consulate car because she wanted the windows down and the sound of the city and the ordinary reality of traffic and the driver's radio playing something she didn't recognize, and she sat in the back with her bag on the seat beside her and let London come in through the open window and replace gradually the recycled cabin air she had been breathing for the better part of 9 hours. Her room was on the 4th floor overlooking a narrow street with a pub on the corner and a row of plane trees that had lost most of their leaves, which made them look honest rather than bare, the structure of them visible, the essential architecture showing. She stood at the window for a moment before taking off her jacket, looking at the street going about its evening business. She turned on the television and found a news channel and watched without sound for 30 seconds. The photograph of Hollis on the tarmac was on the screen she had known it would be, and below it a chyron about a federal investigation and an airline statement, and then another angle of the photograph, and then a split screen with someone talking in a studio. She watched it for 30 seconds, and then she pointed the remote at the screen and turned it off, and the room was quiet again, with just the sound of the street below. She opened her bag and took out her laptop. A notification on the secure mail application Liberty Atlantic had issued its formal statement, and below it, marked for your records, Foote's office had forwarded the full text. She read it once. The language was direct in the way that statements are direct when the person writing them has decided not to hide. Termination, independent audit, structural review, external oversight. The words of someone who had made the decision to mean it. She read it once and closed the notification and did not open it again. Then her phone buzzed. An unknown number, she almost let it go, then answered on the 3rd ring. British Financial Times. Row 3. A. You handled it with grace. Safe travels. She stood at the window with the phone in her hand and the message on the screen, and she felt something move through her that was warm and unexpected, and not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. She typed back 2 words. You too. And then she set the phone down on the desk, and she stood there for a moment with her hand still resting on it, feeling something that took her a second to name. It was being seen. The simple, rare, irreducible thing of having been present in an experience and having someone else confirm that the experience was real. She moved to the small armchair by the window with Meditations in her hand, and she sat and tucked her feet beneath her and opened it not to the marked passage but to the first page, the beginning, as if starting from the top of something she had been in the middle of for years. She read 2 paragraphs about the nature of a rational mind, about the relationship between perception and reaction, and then she set it on the arm of the chair and looked out the window at the plane trees in the yellow light and the pub filling up with the end-of-day crowd and the ordinary, unremarkable beauty of a city being itself. She picked up her phone. Not for work, not for the tablet or the encrypted application or the secure mail, her personal phone, the one with her mother's number at the top of the recent calls list. She pressed it. It rang once, twice. Then Gloria Carter's voice, with the particular warmth it always had, the voice of someone who picked up the phone to their children with the same openness every single time, regardless of hour or history, because that was simply the kind of person she was. Baby, her mother said. Naomi said, Hi, Ma. You sound different, her mother said. Not tired, something else. "You okay?" "I'm okay," Naomi said. And then, without intending to add anything, she added, "The flight was long, but I landed right." Her mother was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was absorbing something without asking for more than was being offered. Then she said, "Good. That's all that matters." They talked for 11 minutes. Not about the flight, not about the work, not about anything that would be on a news chyron tomorrow morning or a federal filing next week. They talked about her mother's neighbor's dog who had developed an attachment to the television and barked at any show involving animals. They talked about Gloria's book club, which had chosen something Gloria described as too long and too depressing, but honestly quite good. They talked about the weather in Baltimore, which her mother reported was that specific kind of gray that makes you want soup, and about the soup she had made and whether Naomi had been eating properly, which was the question her mother always came to eventually, and which Naomi always answered the same way, and both of them always knew the answer was incomplete, and neither of them minded. When the call ended, Naomi sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone and the sound of the call still in the room. Somehow the warmth of it hanging in the air, the way warmth lingers in a space after a source of it has moved on. She had spent 9 months on an operation whose stakes were genuinely serious, and she had landed it, and she had spent 8 hours on a flight that had become something she had not chosen, but had handled, and she had landed that too. And now she was sitting in an armchair in a London hotel room with meditations on the arm of the chair, and the sound of her mother's voice still available to her in memory. And she felt for the first time in as long as she could accurately measure fully present in her own life. She reached for the book. She turned to the underlined passage, the one she had been returning to all flight, the one that had been there waiting each time she needed it. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." She read it once. She closed the book and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight and its worn edges, and the particular solidity of something that has been carried everywhere, and has therefore absorbed something of everywhere it has been. Then she set it on the windowsill where the last of the London light was resting. Tomorrow she would board another flight. She would carry her encrypted tablet and her credential case and her Marcus Aurelius and the specific quality of attention that had been built in her over 12 years, by everything she had seen and done and chosen and refused to back down from. She would do the work that was hers to do, in rooms that were not always ready for her, in ways that did not always look like what people expected strength to look like. Tonight she had already arrived. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity matters more than any uniform or title, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories where truth rises and justice lands where it belongs, subscribe to our channel. The quietest voices sometimes carry the farthest.